Saigon, 1968. A North Vietnamese soldier opens his eyes. The last thing he remembers is the rattle of machine guns, screams, pain. Now he's lying in a bed, an actual bed, with white sheets. The air is cool, air-conditioned. An American medic hands him something in a can. Peaches, in syrup. More sugar in one can than his family saw in a month back home. He's confused. This isn't how prisoners are supposed to be treated. This isn't what the commissars told him about American barbarity. This is the 50th medical company in Long Binh, and what happens here will quietly unravel everything he thought he knew about the war. The Americans had a problem in Vietnam that no one talks about. Not the guerrilla warfare, not the jungle, not the protests back home. The problem was simple and strange. They were too rich, too comfortable, too abundant. And when Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers saw this abundance firsthand as prisoners or defectors, it broke something fundamental in their worldview. This is the story of how ice cream, Coca-Cola, and medical care became weapons more powerful than bombs. How abundance defeated ideology. How men who came to destroy America left as witnesses to something they couldn't explain to their comrades. This is about the war that was won and lost in field hospitals and prison camps, one meal at a time. To understand the shock, you need to understand what these North Vietnamese soldiers were eating before capture. We're not talking about military rations here. We're talking about survival. Rice, that's the baseline. But not the white, fluffy rice you're thinking of. This was old rice, stored for months, sometimes years. Transported down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in bags carried on bicycles and backs. By the time it reached units in the south, it was often rotten, full of weevils, mixed with rat droppings. One former Viet Cong described it as crunchy because of all the insects. And here's the thing. That was the good days. On bad days, when supply lines were cut, when American B-52s had bombed the trail, soldiers ate what they could find. Cassava roots dug from the jungle floor, sweet potatoes if they were lucky, bamboo shoots. Sometimes they caught fish from muddy rivers. Occasionally, very occasionally, there was meat, snake, monkey, rat, dog if they were near a village. A North Vietnamese soldier's daily ration was supposed to be about 600 grams of rice. That's it. No meat, no vegetables unless you found them yourself. No sugar, no fruit unless you stumbled on it in the jungle. The caloric intake was roughly 1,200 to 1,500 calories daily for men humping heavy weapons through mountains and jungle. Compare that to what we'll see American prisoners of war in the North eating, and they were being starved as a torture method. Same rotten rice, same deprivation. The difference? For the Americans, it was intentional cruelty. For the North Vietnamese troops, it was just normal. Weight loss was universal. Soldiers routinely lost 30, 40, 50 pounds during their deployment south. Malnutrition was so common, it wasn't even remarked upon. Vitamin deficiencies caused night blindness. Protein deficiency caused muscle wasting. These men were hungry, constantly, gnawingly hungry. And then they got captured. The Tet Offensive, January 1968. Thousands of Viet Cong and NVA soldiers poured into cities across South Vietnam. The offensive was a military disaster. Bodies everywhere. Wounded men lying in the streets. American units taking casualties had a protocol. Treat your own wounded first, but then, and this is where it gets interesting, treat enemy wounded second, not third, not last, second, right after your own guys. A Viet Cong fighter, leg torn apart by shrapnel, expects to be left to die. That's what happens in war. Instead, an American medic is kneeling beside him, cutting away his black pajamas, starting an IV. The plastic bag of clear fluid looks like magic. He's never seen an IV before. The morphine hits. Pain that's been unbearable becomes distant, manageable. He's placed on a stretcher. A helicopter lands nearby. They're flying him to a field hospital. Think about this moment. This soldier has spent months, maybe years, in the jungle. He's had dysentery, malaria, probably intestinal parasites. He's been hungry every single day. The best medical care he's seen is a political officer with some bandages and maybe, if he's incredibly lucky, some captured antibiotics. Now he's in a Huey, flying over the jungle canopy. Below him is the Khu Chai tunnels where he might have lived in the dark, eating rotten rice. Above him is an American medic, making sure he doesn't die. They land at the 50th Medical Company in Long Binh, and that's when the real shock begins. The 50th Medical Company was a clearing station. Not even a full hospital. Just a place to stabilize patients before moving them to bigger facilities in Saigon or on hospital ships. But to a North Vietnamese soldier, it looked like something from a science fiction film. The buildings have electricity. Constant electricity. Not generators that run for a few hours, always on. The lights never flicker. There are fans. Electric fans. Some rooms even have air conditioning. The wounded VC fighter is carried into a ward. 3 wards, actually, all surrounded by fencing and barbed wire, guarded by MPS. But inside these wards, something remarkable happens. He's placed on a bed. Not a cot, not a mat on the ground. A bed with a mattress, with metal frame, with sheets. Clean white sheets that smell of soap. When was the last time he slept on something that wasn't dirt or bamboo? A doctor examines him. An actual doctor, not a medic with a few weeks training. The doctor has tools, stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, surgical instruments that gleam under the fluorescent lights, X-ray machines to see inside bodies, anesthesia to put you to sleep during surgery. They operate on him, remove the shrapnel, clean the wound, give him antibiotics. Real antibiotics. Not the expired or fake ones sometimes available in the North. Penicillin, the wound that would have killed him through infection, that would have at best left him crippled, gets proper treatment. And then, the food arrives. A medical orderly brings a tray. The Vietnamese prisoner stares at it. This must be a mistake. This can't be for him. White rice. Not the brown, buggy, half-rotten rice he's been eating for years. Pure white rice, steamed, fluffy. More rice than he'd normally eat in 2 days. Meat, actual meat. Sometimes it's chicken, sometimes beef. It's not much by American standards, a few ounces. But it's meat, at every meal. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. He hasn't had meat daily since before the war started. Vegetables. Canned vegetables usually, but vegetables. Green beans, corn, carrots. Food with vitamins, with color, with nutrition. Fruit. This is what breaks many of them. A can of peaches in heavy syrup, or fruit cocktail with cherries, pineapple, grapes. The sweetness is overwhelming. The sugar content in one can exceeds what they'd normally consume in a week. Milk. Powdered milk mixed with water. But still, milk. Protein. Calcium. Something many haven't tasted since childhood. And bread. White bread, soft and fresh, sometimes with butter. Real butter, not whatever substitute the commissars said was just as good. The caloric content of these meals? Around 3,000 to 3,500 calories daily, more than double what NVA soldiers received in the field. The prisoners are being fed better than their own officers back in Hanoi. One Vietnamese prisoner, interviewed years later, described his first meal. He said he cried, not from pain, not from despair, but from the taste of the peaches. He'd forgotten fruit could taste like that. Sweet, soft, abundant. The can was his to finish. No one took it away. No one rationed it. He could eat until he was full. That word. Full. When was the last time he'd been full? The Americans running these medical facilities faced a bizarre moral dilemma. They were required, under the Geneva Conventions, to provide adequate medical care to prisoners of war. But what's adequate when you're the richest country on earth, treating soldiers from one of the poorest? The standard American military ration was already excessive by North Vietnamese standards. C rations that American GIs complained about, calling them cardboard and shit, contained luxuries that Vietnamese soldiers had never experienced. Instant coffee, sugar tablets, candy, cigarettes, cheese spread, crackers that weren't moldy. So the Americans just treated VC prisoners the same as everyone else. Same food from the same kitchens, same medical care from the same doctors. Not because they were being especially kind, but because it was standard procedure. Treat all patients equally. And that equality is what created the psychological impact. These Vietnamese prisoners would watch American soldiers in adjacent wards getting the same food, the same care. Sometimes the Americans would complain. "This food sucks," they'd say, pushing away a tray that contained more nutrition than a VC fighter's weekly ration. The Americans threw food away. This fact appears in multiple accounts, and it's always mentioned with a sense of shock. After meals, American patients who weren't that hungry would leave food on their trays, and the orderlies would just throw it away, scrape it into garbage bins, perfectly good rice, untouched meat, fruit cocktail barely eaten. From a Vietnamese perspective, this was obscene. This was incomprehensible. Food was precious. Food was survival. You didn't waste food any more than you'd waste ammunition. But the Americans wasted it casually, thoughtlessly, because there was always more. The supply lines brought more food every day, more than could be eaten. The abundance was so vast that waste didn't matter. If food was shocking, Coca-Cola was mind-breaking. The hospital had a small canteen where ambulatory patients could buy items, cigarettes, toiletries, snacks, and soft drinks, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, orange soda. For 5 cents a nickel, you could buy a bottle of Coca-Cola, ice cold, from a refrigerated cooler that was always full. North Vietnamese prisoners who earned small amounts from labor or who received a bit of money from the Americans for cooperation could buy these drinks. And many did, because they had to know if this was real. The first sip of Coca-Cola became a moment of revelation reported again and again in post-war accounts. That sweetness, that carbonation, fizzing on the tongue, that cold shock in a tropical climate, the taste of something completely unnecessary, purely for pleasure, purely for enjoyment. One former NVA soldier, decades later, said that Coca-Cola explained America better than any propaganda. It wasn't a necessity. It wasn't nutritious. It was just nice. Something that existed solely to make life more pleasant. And it cost 5 cents. The same price Americans paid. The same price American children paid with their allowance money. This wasn't special treatment for prisoners. This was just normal. In America, Normal people drank Coca-Cola casually. They had preferences between Coke and Pepsi. They chose based on taste, not availability. The concept of choosing between luxuries rather than struggling for necessities represented a different universe. And the bottles. Those iconic glass bottles. Vietnamese prisoners learned that every Coca-Cola tasted exactly the same, whether in California or Vietnam. The quality control, the standardization, the distribution network that could deliver identical drinks anywhere Americans were stationed. This represented organizational capacity that dwarfed anything the North Vietnamese military could achieve. The Coca-Cola Company's war production was public information. 5 billion bottles in 1943 during World War II. Even more by Vietnam. The Americans considered soft drinks essential for morale. Essential. Not a luxury to be rationed, but a necessity to be provided in unlimited quantities. Some medical facilities in Vietnam had something that seemed impossible. Ice cream. Not all of them. It required serious refrigeration. But larger bases, including some where prisoners might be held temporarily, had electric ice cream makers. Or they had access to ice cream bars shipped in refrigerated containers. Ice cream in tropical Vietnam. Think about the logistics of that. The electricity to run freezers 24/7. The supply chain to bring cream, sugar, and flavorings. The casual decision that, yes, this is worth it. Ice cream improves morale. Let's make sure our troops have ice cream. Vietnamese prisoners who witnessed ice cream being served describe it with a sense of unreality. Frozen sweetness in the middle of a war zone. Multiple flavors, chocolate, vanilla, strawberry. Americans had preferences. They'd say, I don't like strawberry. Got any chocolate? Having preferences about luxury items. That's the key concept here. When you're hungry, you eat whatever's available and grateful for it. When you're fed, you develop preferences. You become picky. The Americans were picky. They had so much food they could afford to have opinions about it. The Navy actually built ice cream ships for the Pacific Fleet during World War II. Floating ice cream factories. Because ice cream was that important to American morale. This wasn't a secret. This was something Americans were proud of. They wrote articles about it. They considered it a sign of civilization. We can make ice cream anywhere. To Vietnamese prisoners, ice cream became symbolic. It represented everything they weren't, everything their country couldn't provide. You can't make ice cream when you can't keep the lights on consistently. You can't have ice cream when sugar is desperately rationed. You can't deliver ice cream to troops when your supply lines barely manage ammunition and rice. Ice cream was possibility made frozen. It was the American way of war, so rich, so abundant, that luxuries became standard. Beyond food, the medical care itself shattered assumptions. The Viet Cong and NVA expected to be tortured. Their political officers told them that Americans were war criminals who would mutilate prisoners. So when American doctors instead provided world-class medical care, it created cognitive dissonance. Antibiotics worked. Infections that would have killed you in the jungle cleared up in days. Wounds healed cleanly instead of festering. Pain relief was real and consistent, not occasional scraps of morphine hoarded desperately. Surgical capability was stunning. Americans could do operations in field hospitals that required major facilities in Hanoi, when such facilities worked at all. Orthopedic surgery to fix broken bones properly. Removal of shrapnel. Even some internal surgery. One account describes a North Vietnamese soldier with a badly broken leg. In the jungle, This would have been a death sentence, or at best, an amputation. Instead, American surgeons used steel pins and plates to reconstruct the bone. Physical therapy helped him walk again. He was treated not just to survive, but to recover fully. The casual nature of this care was what struck prisoners. This wasn't special treatment. This was routine. The Americans did this for every patient, enemy or not. They had the supplies, the equipment, the trained personnel to make it routine. Dental care existed. Actual dentists who could fill cavities, pull infected teeth without just ripping them out. Provide pain relief during dental procedures. Many Vietnamese soldiers had never been to a dentist. Toothache meant suffering until the tooth rotted out. Blood transfusions. The Americans had blood banks. They could give you someone else's blood to replace what you'd lost. This seemed like necromancy. How do you store blood? How do you make sure it matches? How do you have so much blood available that you can give it to enemies? The supply chain was the real miracle. Every week, new supplies arrived. Bandages, medicine, surgical equipment, food, everything in such quantities that running out was never a concern. The logistics of keeping a field hospital supplied with everything it needed, in a war zone, continuously, without fail. This was America's true strength. Vietnamese prisoners watched and learned. They learned that American power wasn't just bombs and helicopters. It was the boring stuff. The supply clerks who made sure shipments arrived. The refrigeration units that kept food fresh. The generators that never ran out of fuel. The systematic, organized, bureaucratic efficiency that made abundance possible. Some prisoners weren't prisoners for long. They became defectors. The Chiu Hoi program, Open Arms, offered Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers a way out, amnesty, safety rehabilitation, and the promise of that same abundance they'd glimpsed in medical facilities. From 1963 to 1973, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 enemy combatants defected through Chiu Hoi. The real number is disputed because many defections weren't sincere. Soldiers looking for temporary respite before returning to their units. But tens of thousands were genuine. What made them defect? Often, it was the food. Sergeant Major Tran Van Tran's story is documented. He was a communist infiltrator sent to South Vietnam. His mission was to gather intelligence, to remain undercover, to serve the revolution. But then he saw how South Vietnamese lived. More importantly, he saw how Americans lived. The abundance was undeniable. Markets with food, shops with goods, electricity most of the time, running water in cities, regular meals. People who weren't just surviving, but living. Tran Van Tran defected. He became a trainer for the Kit Carson Scout program, teaching Americans about VC tactics. But more importantly, his defection represented thousands of similar realizations. The revolution promised liberation and prosperity. America was already delivering it. Chiu Hoi centers offered defectors 3 meals daily, medical care, vocational training, housing, simple things really. But compared to life in the jungle eating buggy rice, these simple things were revolutionary. The most devastating part? Defectors could write home. They could send packages to their families in North Vietnam. And they did, using wages from work. Former VC fighters bought American goods, instant coffee, canned milk, chocolate, and mailed them north. Think about that reversal. Prisoners and defectors in the South sending food to their families in the victorious North. The cognitive dissonance must have been crushing for true believers. The packages kept coming throughout the war. The Red Cross facilitated this. Families in Hanoi receiving Hershey bars from sons who were supposed to be suffering in capitalist captivity. How do you maintain faith in the revolution when your imprisoned son is better fed than you? The American military had unintentionally created a psychological warfare weapon more powerful than anything they designed. But it was double-edged. Because all of this abundance, the food, the medicine, the Coca-Cola, the ice cream, was being provided in a country experiencing a brutal war. Vietnamese civilians saw American bases with their PX stores full of goods, while their villages were being bombed. They saw Americans eating steaks while refugees starved. The Viet Cong used this contrast brilliantly in their propaganda. "Look at the Americans," they'd say. "They have everything while you have nothing. They eat meat while your children are hungry. Is this justice?" But prisoners who experienced that abundance firsthand had a different perspective. Yes, the Americans had excess. But they also shared it. They treated enemy wounded. They fed prisoners. They showed mercy even to those who'd tried to kill them. This generosity confused the ideological framework. The Americans were supposed to be imperialist oppressors. Oppressors don't heal the wounds of those who oppose them. They don't feed them better than their own side does. They don't offer ice cream to enemies. The contradiction couldn't be resolved within the Marxist-Leninist framework that North Vietnamese soldiers had been taught. Either the Americans were evil imperialists, or they were something else. The evidence of their own experience suggested something else. As the war progressed, physical evidence of this treatment gap became visible. Released prisoners returned to North Vietnamese units noticeably heavier than when captured. In a war zone where everyone was losing weight from malnutrition and stress, returned prisoners had gained weight. Their skin looked healthier. Their energy was better. This was biologically undeniable. You can't fake healthy weight gain. You can't pretend to be nourished when you're starving. Political officers tried to explain this away. The Americans were trying to corrupt prisoners with luxury. The abundance was a trap. True revolutionaries would resist such temptation. But hungry men found it hard to see abundance as a trap. When your daily experience is deprivation, being fed feels like liberation, not corruption. Soldiers who'd been seriously wounded and healed in American facilities created another problem for the commissars. These men had injuries that would have been death sentences in the jungle. Compound fractures, abdominal wounds, serious infections. They should have died. Instead, they returned with functioning limbs, healed wounds, and stories of surgical miracles. American doctors had saved their lives. Not because they extracted information. Most prisoners never provided useful intelligence. But because that's what doctors do. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have an exemption for enemies. American medical personnel seemed to take this seriously. They treated patients regardless of uniform. This created profound confusion. How do you hate people who saved your life? How do you call them monsters when they treated your infected wounds and gave you peaches in syrup? The cruelest comparison came from American prisoners of war in North Vietnam. The Hanoi Hilton, Hoa Lo Prison, the various camps throughout the North. These places were notorious. American pilots shot down over North Vietnam endured years of brutal captivity. Torture, starvation, isolation, psychological abuse designed to break them. The North Vietnamese justified this treatment by claiming Americans were war criminals, not legitimate prisoners of war. They deserved harsh treatment. But word got out, slowly, about what North Vietnamese prisoners experienced in American captivity. Through released prisoners, through defectors, through the grapevine that exists in any war. Americans in the North ate the same rotten rice Vietnamese soldiers ate in the field. It was intentionally inadequate, designed to weaken them. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese in American medical facilities ate better than American soldiers sometimes, because medical facilities fed patients well to aid recovery. Americans in the North were tortured routinely, ropes cutting off circulation, beatings, stress positions, sleep deprivation. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese prisoners received medical care, pain relief, surgery when needed. Americans in the North were kept in isolation, forbidden to communicate. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese prisoners in the South were housed together, could talk, could receive mail, could write letters. The contrast was stark and public. International Red Cross reports documented both situations. Journalists saw both systems. The difference wasn't subtle. This comparison undermined North Vietnamese propaganda about American brutality. If Americans were such monsters, why did they treat VC prisoners better than the North Vietnamese treated American prisoners? The answer was uncomfortable. Because Americans could afford to. Because they had the food to spare, the medicine to spare, the human decency to spare. Abundance enabled mercy. Scarcity encouraged cruelty. When the war ended in 1975, thousands of former South Vietnamese soldiers and officials ended up in re-education camps. These camps, run by the victorious North Vietnamese government, were supposed to reform thinking through labor and education. What they actually did was show former enemies that the promised abundance of communist victory was a lie. In re-education camps, prisoners experienced the same deprivation that North Vietnamese soldiers had endured during the war. Inadequate rice rations, no meat, no medical care beyond the most basic. Hard labor, malnutrition, disease. Former ARVN soldiers who'd eaten in American mess halls, who'd seen American abundance, who'd had access to PX stores and ice cream and Coca-Cola, now ate worse than they had as prisoners of the Americans. The irony was crushing. Defeat at American hands had meant abundance. Victory by their own countrymen meant starvation. Many former prisoners of the Americans, now imprisoned by their own government, thought back to those field hospitals, those medical wards, those meals with peaches in heavy syrup. They'd been treated better by enemies than by their own side after liberation. This realization spread slowly through Vietnamese society. The victory had brought poverty. The American withdrawal had removed the prosperity their presence had created, however unevenly distributed. By the 1980s, Vietnam was experiencing widespread hunger, children going blind from vitamin A deficiency, stunted growth from protein deficiency, ration coupons for food that often wasn't available. Former soldiers who'd been captured by Americans, who'd experienced that medical care and regular meals, told their families about what they'd seen. At first, these stories were dismissed as exaggerations. Surely the Americans hadn't been that generous. Surely the abundance hadn't been that casual. But as Vietnam opened up in the late 1980s and 1990s, as people saw Western countries firsthand, they realized the stories had been true. Americans really did have that much. That abundance hadn't been propaganda or special show for prisoners. It was real. It was normal. It was everyday life in the West. In 1994, the U.S. trade embargo on Vietnam ended. In 1995, diplomatic relations were restored, and Coca-Cola returned to Vietnam. The significance of this was greater than you might think. For Vietnamese who'd fought against Americans, Coca-Cola carried memories. For some, it was their first taste in a field hospital after capture. For others, it was something they'd drunk as defectors in Cheo Hoi centers. For a few, it was a luxury they'd stolen or traded for in the jungle. Coca-Cola became available in Vietnam again, not through black markets or special channels, but normally in stores. Anyone with a bit of money could buy one. Just like in America, just like in that field hospital 30 years ago. Former Viet Cong and NVA soldiers tasted Coca-Cola again and remembered. Some remembered bitterly. This is what we were fighting against. This is what we could have had earlier without the war. Others remembered with a kind of wonder. It still tastes the same, exactly the same. Perfect standardization after 3 decades. For younger Vietnamese who'd grown up after the war, hearing about the American time, Coca-Cola was a connection to stories their fathers and uncles told. Stories about abundance. Stories about being fed better as prisoners than as free men. Stories that seemed like myths until you could buy a Coke yourself and realize, yes, this is real. This is what they meant. Today, Vietnam is one of Coca-Cola's significant markets in Southeast Asia. The company that represented American abundance during the war now operates openly in the country. The circle is complete in a way that's both mundane and profound. The story of North Vietnamese prisoners in American medical facilities should have taught clear lessons about soft power, about the political impact of humanitarian treatment, about how abundance can defeat ideology. Did anyone learn these lessons? The United States continued, in subsequent wars, to create the same dynamic. In Iraq and Afghanistan, captured enemy fighters often experienced better living conditions as prisoners than they had as free men. Better food, better medical care, better shelter. And just like in Vietnam, this created confusion and cognitive dissonance. The great enemy, the great Satan, was treating them better than their own leaders had. But America never quite figured out how to leverage this soft power effectively. The abundance was accidental. It wasn't a strategy, but a byproduct of being rich. Americans treated prisoners well because that's what the Geneva Conventions required and because they could afford to. The propaganda value was never fully exploited. There was no systematic effort to say, "Look, we feed our prisoners better than your government feeds you." That would have seemed crass, un-American even. Americans believed in doing the right thing for its own sake, not for propaganda value. So the treatment remained good, but the story stayed mostly untold. Prisoners experienced American abundance, sometimes converted because of it. But the broader public rarely heard about it. In Vietnam, thousands of enemy fighters saw American plenty firsthand. Some defected because of it. Others carried the memory home and infected their families with doubt about the revolution. But systematically, strategically, the United States never quite weaponized its own generosity. Let's do some cold math here. What did it cost America to treat enemy prisoners well? In 1968, the daily ration cost for a U.S. soldier in Vietnam was approximately $3 to $4. This included 3 meals plus any additional food from PX purchases. Medical care cost was harder to calculate, but the military budgeted roughly $50 per day per patient in field hospitals. So treating a wounded VC prisoner for, say, 2 weeks, while he recovered from surgery and wounds cost maybe $800 to $1,000. Maybe more if surgery was complex. Maybe less if recovery was quick. What did this buy strategically? 1 defector? Maybe, if the treatment was good enough and the soldier was disillusioned enough. That defector could provide intelligence, could become a Kit Carson scout and save American lives, could go home after the war and tell his family that Americans weren't monsters. Or one released prisoner who returned to his unit carrying memories of abundance, who told his comrades that American prisoners ate better than they did, who created doubt, who made others wonder if they were on the right side, or one former enemy who, 30 years later, would tell his children and grandchildren that Americans were generous in victory. That shaped how the next generation viewed America. Was it worth $1,000 to buy that? From a pure cost-benefit analysis. Compare it to the cost of dropping bombs. A single B-52 bombing run could cost $50,000 to $100,000 in munitions. How many hearts and minds did that change? Usually zero. Often it created more enemies through collateral damage. The math should have been obvious. Treating prisoners well was the cheapest, most effective propaganda America never deliberately employed. But wars aren't run by accountants doing cost-benefit analysis on soft power. Wars are run by generals who think in terms of firepower and body counts and territory controlled. So the United States kept bombing villages at enormous cost while accidentally winning hearts and minds in field hospitals at minimal cost. The irony is painful. America's greatest weapon in Vietnam was its casual generosity, and nobody in command seemed to realize it. Interviews with Vietnamese veterans conducted in the 1990s and 2000s after relations normalized reveal fascinating patterns. Veterans who'd been wounded and treated in American facilities almost universally spoke positively about that care. They distinguished between the war and the hospital. Yes, they'd fought Americans. Yes, they'd tried to kill Americans. But when wounded and helpless, Americans had helped them. This separated the political from the personal in their memories. The war was about ideology, about liberation, about nationalism. But the treatment after capture was about human decency. You could oppose America politically while respecting American mercy. One veteran, interviewed for a documentary, described his confusion after being treated. "They saved my leg," he said. "The doctor worked on me for hours." Why? I had tried to kill Americans the day before. Why did they save my leg? He never got a satisfactory answer because there wasn't a grand strategic reason. The doctor saved his leg because that's what doctors do. But to someone raised under a system where everything had political motivation, where mercy was suspicious, this made no sense. Another veteran remembered the food with startling clarity. "Peaches," he said. "I remember the peaches most. My daughter asked me once what Americans were like, and I said, 'They gave me peaches when I was their prisoner.' She didn't understand. How could peaches explain Americans? But they do. They had so much they could give peaches to enemies." The specificity of these memories is striking. Not general impressions, but specific details. The taste of Coca-Cola, the coldness of ice cream, the softness of white bread, the sweetness of canned fruit. These sensory memories carried more power than political analysis. You can argue about imperialism and capitalism and socialism, but you can't argue about whether you were hungry and then fed. That's empirical. That's lived experience. The generation born after the war, hearing these stories from their fathers, often responded with skepticism. The stories sounded too good to be true. American prisoners ate meat daily. Surely not. They had ice cream in tropical hospitals? Impossible. They threw food away. That's wasteful beyond belief. Coca-Cola cost 5 cents and tasted the same everywhere? How? The stories sounded like war stories always sound. Exaggerated, improved in the retelling, distorted by memory and time. But then Vietnam opened up. People could travel. People could emigrate. And Vietnamese people visiting or living in America or other Western countries discovered that the stories had been true. Understated even. American grocery stores were overwhelming to first-time Vietnamese visitors. Entire aisles of breakfast cereals, dozens of types of bread, fresh meat, seafood, produce in quantities that seemed obscene, and prices that made it all accessible to ordinary people. The children who doubted their father's stories stood in American supermarkets and realized that, yes, this was what the POWs had tried to explain. This abundance that seems impossible is just normal here. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through Vietnamese diaspora communities. Your father wasn't exaggerating. America really was that wealthy. The prisoners really had been fed that well. The abundance wasn't propaganda or temporary. It was the baseline American experience. This created a strange dynamic in Vietnamese-American communities. The older generation, who'd fought against America, often ended up defending America to their children. "You don't understand," they'd say. "You didn't see what I saw. When I was wounded, they saved my life. When I was hungry, they fed me. You can criticize America, but don't say they weren't generous." Here's what hasn't changed in the decades since the war ended. America is still absurdly wealthy. Americans still waste food casually. American medical care is still the most technologically advanced in the world. Coca-Cola still tastes the same everywhere. What Vietnam revealed wasn't unique to Vietnam. It was simply what happens when the world's richest country goes to war. The abundance travels with the military. The wealth is portable. In Iraq, captured insurgents experienced the same shock. Better food than they'd eaten as free men. Medical care they couldn't afford in civilian life. Treatment that contradicted everything they'd been told about American cruelty. In Afghanistan, Taliban prisoners encountered the same dynamic. Americans who'd fight you viciously in combat would then treat your wounds meticulously as prisoners. The disconnect between battlefield ruthlessness and prisoner care confused ideological certainty. The pattern repeats because America hasn't changed fundamentally. It's still rich. It still believes in following the rules, including Geneva Conventions. It still provides better treatment to prisoners than most countries provide to their own soldiers. And it still doesn't quite know what to do with this soft power. Still doesn't systematically leverage the fact that captured enemies often leave custody healthier and better fed than when they arrived. The United States could build an entire counterinsurgency strategy around this. Come fight us, get captured, receive better living standards than your own side provides. That sounds cynical, but it's essentially what happened in Vietnam accidentally. Instead, America continues to treat prisoners well because it's the right thing to do, not because it's an effective strategy. Which is, oddly, why it works. The generosity reads as genuine because it is genuine. The North Vietnamese won the war. They achieved their objective, unification under Hanoi's control. They drove out the Americans. They survived everything American power could throw at them. And their prize? Poverty, hunger, deprivation, years of re-education camps, and economic collapse. The American war ended, and living standards plummeted. Meanwhile, the prisoners who'd been captured and suffered in American captivity. They'd been the lucky ones. They'd eaten better during their imprisonment than their countrymen did for years after victory. Some former prisoners emigrated to America after relations normalized. They moved to the country they'd fought against and found that, yes, the abundance they'd glimpsed in field hospitals was real and widespread. You could work an ordinary job and eat meat regularly. You could buy Coca-Cola without thinking about the cost. Your children could have ice cream casually. One veteran who moved to California in the 1990s told a reporter, "I fought America for years. I spent months trying to kill Americans. And when they captured me, they treated me better than my own government did after we won. I'm not saying we were wrong to fight. I'm saying I understand now what we were up against." What they were up against wasn't just military power. It was a system so productive, so wealthy, so abundant that it could treat enemies better than those enemies treated themselves. You can't defeat that with ideology. You can't defeat that with guerrilla tactics. You can outlast it. Americans eventually went home. But you can't beat it. Vietnam won the war and lost the peace. They won territory and lost prosperity. They achieved unity and lost abundance. The great irony: the Americans who lost the war and went home still had everything. The Vietnamese who won the war and stayed home had nothing. Decades after the war, Vietnamese veterans will sometimes buy a Coca-Cola, drink it slowly, and remember. Remember lying in a hospital bed with white sheets. Remember the first time they tasted peaches in syrup. Remember American doctors working to save the life of an enemy. These memories sit uncomfortably with official narratives of the war. Vietnam won. That's the official story. Glorious victory over American imperialists. The people's struggle triumphed. But individual memories complicate that narrative. Yes, we won. But we were hungry for 20 years after. Yes, we drove them out. But they treated us better than our own side did. These complications don't negate the victory. Vietnam is independent. Vietnam is unified. Vietnam is growing and prosperous now. But the path to that prosperity ran through acknowledging what worked in the West. Doi Moi, the economic reforms that started in 1986, essentially admitted that market economics and international trade created more abundance than central planning. Vietnam adopted elements of the system it had fought against, and it worked. Vietnam today has growing wealth, improving living standards, and yes, all the Coca-Cola you want. The veterans who remember American field hospitals saw the future. They glimpsed what prosperity looked like. It took Vietnam decades to achieve some of that prosperity for itself. But they eventually got there. The question nobody wants to ask: how many years of poverty could have been avoided if Vietnam had just bought into that system earlier? How many deaths from malnutrition? How much stunted growth in children who didn't get enough protein? That's speculation. That's what-if history. But the question haunts Vietnamese who remember both the wartime abundance American prisoners experienced and the post-war poverty everyone endured. This isn't just interesting trivia about the Vietnam War. This is a case study in how wealth defeats ideology. The North Vietnamese were committed ideologically. They believed in their cause. They endured incredible suffering for that cause. They won their war. But when individual soldiers saw abundance firsthand, many defected. Not because they were bribed, but because they saw an alternative to deprivation. They saw that prosperity was possible. They saw that their suffering wasn't noble sacrifice, but unnecessary poverty. Ideology can motivate people through hardship, but it struggles when confronted with concrete abundance. You can tell people that sacrifice is necessary for the revolution. It's harder to maintain that when prisoners are eating better than revolutionaries. This applies beyond Vietnam. Every conflict between wealthy nations and poor ones creates this dynamic. The wealth gap is visible and undeniable. Modern terrorism and insurgency often relies on controlling information, keeping fighters isolated from Western abundance, maintaining the narrative that the West is decadent and weak. But when fighters encounter Western prosperity firsthand, the narrative crumbles. Decadence looks like abundance. Weakness looks like mercy. The contradictions become impossible to resolve. This is why authoritarian regimes work so hard to control information flow. Not just political information, but information about how people live elsewhere. Once you know that ordinary people in other countries have more, have better, have easier lives, maintaining commitment to sacrifice becomes much harder. Summer 1968. A North Vietnamese soldier opens his eyes in a hospital bed. The last thing he remembers is jungle combat. Now he's in air conditioning, lying on clean sheets, with antibiotics in his system and a can of peaches on the tray beside him. He doesn't know it yet, but this moment will define how he sees the world for the rest of his life. He'll return to his unit after being released in a prisoner exchange. He'll fight to the war's end, he'll see Saigon fall and unification achieved. But he'll never forget the peaches. He'll never forget that America, the great enemy, treated him better than his own side ever did. He'll never forget that the promised abundance of communist victory was already real in American captivity. Decades later, drinking a Coca-Cola in a reunified Vietnam that has finally achieved some prosperity, he'll remember. And he'll wonder what might have been different if everyone had known what he learned in that hospital ward. That abundance defeats deprivation, that mercy defeats cruelty, that the side with ice cream usually wins, not through military might, but through making people question why they're fighting for the side without ice cream. The war was won and lost on many fronts: military, political, strategic. But there was another front that history mostly forgot. The front where American abundance faced communist ideology, where Coca-Cola faced revolution, where ice cream faced sacrifice. And on that quiet front, in hospital wards and prison camps, in the moment when a hungry soldier tasted peaches and heavy syrup, the war was already lost. Not militarily. Vietnam won that. But ideologically, spiritually, in the space where belief meets reality. Because you can endure anything for a cause you believe in. But it's hard to maintain that belief when your enemies treat you better than your comrades do. When the great Satan gives you ice cream. That's the untold story of the Vietnam War. Not the battles, not the politics, not the strategy. But the moment when hungry men were fed, wounded men were healed, and prisoners discovered that the enemy's casual abundance exceeded their own side's greatest promises. The moment when reality defeated ideology, one can of peaches at a time.